I'm doing a brake job on a 2006 Toyota Camry. I've got my rotors, pads, brake grease, and some brake cleaner. I'm going to unlock the steering wheel so that I can rotate that spindle by hand. The front wheel, I can turn it basically by hand when it's raised off the ground and give myself easier access to stuff by turning it. So just kind of verifying my inspection here. The meat on the brake pad's getting pretty thin, so that was checking the outbound pad, and this is the inside pad right up next to the rotor, getting pretty thin as compared to a new one. Next, I need to get access to the pads to take them off, so I got to take off the caliper. So I'm going to take off the bolts that retain the caliper to the mounting bracket, and these are the slide pins that allow the caliper to float. As the piston is applied on the pad, it will push on the back pad, and then it will slide on those pins, and the whole caliper assembly will, when that piston expands, it will pull the caliper itself and pull the outbound pad in towards the rotor as well, at the same time as the piston's pushing on the back pad. So taking off the caliper with those two caliper slide pin bolts, take those out, and then it just should slide off, and then finding the best setup here with a wire tie to suspend it from the shock so I don't have to disconnect the brake line while I'm doing it, and to keep the stress off of the brake line. And now you can see those pads more clearly. Not a lot of meat there, but the wear indicators, those little metal tabs, aren't yet rubbing on this side. And then just to show you, there's two different sizes of rotors on these Toyota Camrys. There's basically a 10.5 and an 11.5 inch rotor, and I didn't want to go to the parts store twice, and I didn't want to remove my wheel to see what size it was, so I bought both sets of rotors, and then took back the ones I didn't use. But you can see there that mine were the 10.5s. And then taking off the retaining hardware, little pad clips, because I got new ones that came with mine. I got a hardware kit with my brake pads, and so I have new ones. And then pulled out the slide pins and removed the dust boots off of those. They have a little metal backer plate on the one side against the bracket, and so you kind of have to tap on it with a screwdriver to get it out. Now I'm going to remove that bracket itself so I can take off the rotor. That one was a 17 millimeter head on those, and couldn't get enough leverage to break this one free, so I got to put it on a socket and with a longer ratchet, and it broke free fine. If your rotor's having trouble coming off, there's a couple of holes there that are threaded that you can put some bolts in and press it off of the hub. You can put a little tension on it and then whack it with a hammer, and it will kind of bust it free from the hub, but mine came off. My rotor really looks pretty good. These rotors are expensive, comparatively around $40 to $45 per rotor, so you know, if it wasn't for the convenience of getting new ones, I probably could have taken them in and had them turned at the parts store for $10 a piece and had more life out of them. But I got new rotors. Now I'm kind of cleaning up stuff on the bracket where those pad clips rest in. I'm kind of hitting those with a wire brush, and then I'm cleaning out the bore for the caliper slide pins on the bracket so that the caliper can float and do its job without getting seized up or locked up on the bracket and causing uneven pad wear. And then the bolts that retain that bracket had a little bit of anti-seize on them from the factory, and so I hit those up with a wire brush and then refresh that with some new anti-seize. And then I'm putting the bracket back on now that the rotor's on. And you can tell I'm guesstimating, but the spec calls for 75 foot-pounds. And then with a little bit of that brake grease, I'm just very lightly, I don't want this to get on the rotor or on the pads themselves, but those kind of a rust potential spot, I'm hitting with just a little bit of brake grease. And then on the hardware itself, on the inside where the pad's going to rest against, I hit it with just a little bit of grease there too. It's just another contact point. With those installed, I'm ready to put in the new pads. So I'm going to angle that in just a little bit there and snap it into place into its track. Do the same thing with the inside pad. All these these 4 pads for the front brakes, they're all the same, so they're interchangeable. Now I'm going to check the fluid in the master cylinder reservoir, and I don't want it to overflow when I seat this piston in the bore, so the caliper won't fit back over the pads the way it is, because I now have a lot more meat on the pad, and so you got to seat the piston in the bore so that it will fit over the new pads. So as I force the fluid back up into the master cylinder, which is probably going to get me yelled at by somebody, but anyway, you can break the bleeder and squirt the fluid out that way, but because my master cylinder was low and I wasn't worried about harming my particular vehicle, you know, an ABS system or anything like that on my vehicle, I forced the fluid back up into the master cylinder. I'm cleaning the caliper slide pins, and that one of the 2 pins has a little rubber collar on it, so I'm taking care not to damage that as I clean it up a little on the wire brush here. And then I'm greasing that. This is the most important part in the brake job of getting adequate grease, is in these slide pins, so that you have good movement of the caliper to engage the pads. So lubricating that on the pins themselves inside the bracket bore where those pistons will go. I'm putting in just a little bit too. And I got this one backwards from where it came out of. Don't know that it matters, but you can do yours right. That one with the rubber collar actually came off of the bottom bracket, or the bottom caliper slide pin. And then again in with these little 14mm head bolts, and the spec calls for 25 foot-pounds on those. I'm not getting super precise. I'm doing what I feel like's equivalent, but again, that's just me. Then I'm going to clean up where my grubby hands and grease got on the rotors. I don't want to saturate these new pads and rotor and affect the braking at all, so I'm just going to start them out nice and clean. Using a little bit of brake clean. You can get it at any parts store. And then I'll throw on a snow tire. Since I got the wheels off, I'm switching to my winter tread here. And then snug up these lug nuts. That's going to sandwich the rotor between the hub and the wheel itself and keep everything tight. And then lastly, I took off that piece of wire I was using to hang the caliper. And then it's a repeat on the other side. So just doing the same thing in higher speed here. You can see this was the one that was causing me some noise. I was starting to get a little squeak on that one. There was pretty much no pad left. And then I'm redoing this bracket in the bench, cleaning everything up, wire brushing, cleaning bores, lubricating, reinstalling pins after they were cleaned and whatnot. And then again, I'm going to check the master fluid level to make sure I'm not going to be squirting fluid out the master cylinder reservoir onto the floor. So I compressed that caliper, and that brought the fluid level up actually a little bit above full, which makes sense because I hadn't yet pumped the brake and put any fluid back into the caliper. So I pumped the brakes to make sure that my first stop when I'm actually driving works. This is a pretty important step. Otherwise you're going to go to push the brake the first time and nothing's going to happen. And that returned the fluid back down into the calipers, and my fluid level dropped right back down to factory full, which is a good sign. I don't have any leaks in the system, and so when I have new pads, my brake fluid level sitting right where it needs to be. I'm going to do a quick brake inspection on the back. This was a stubborn drum. You could press this one off too, but mine was coming slowly, so I just kind of worked it a little bit at a time until it came free. And then I cleaned it up a little bit, trying not to hit rubber parts with brake clean. I don't want them to swell or be adversely affected by the solvent. So I cleaned up the back drums, checked the linings. They still look really good. And cleaning them up like that, you know, if you're getting a little squeak or anything like that, it's just good to get the dust out of them every now and again too. So putting the rear wheel back on. And then I had forgot to clean up the rotor from handling it on that right front wheel, so that's what I was doing there. Set the tire pressure on these tires, set the torque on all the wheels and lug nuts, so that I don't have one that's a little loose and ends up working off and causing trouble down the road. Hubcaps are going back on, and that's really it. Do one quick check here again with the brakes, make sure that everything's stopping the way it should and my pedal feels good. And that's it. I appreciate you watching, and I hope you like and subscribe.